All right, welcome. We are thrilled to have you all. Folks are still introducing themselves in the chat. This is Akani Freechild. I am in Maryland. I work with Public Citizen and the Secure Our Vote Coalition. We're thrilled to have you on today's Building Relationships with Your Local Election Official call. We are all very concerned about having free and fair and healthy elections, as well as secure elections in 2020. So that voters do not have to make a choice between their health and their vote, and they have safe options and secure options to the best of our collective ability as we face this COVID-19 pandemic. So glad to have everyone on from all over the country. We're thrilled to have some incredible speakers for you here today. Our goal today is to make sure that almost every single person who is on this call calls their local election official this week. Unless you've got a primary or early voting happening soon, don't call them then. But if not, please plan to pick up the phone tomorrow and call at least one of your local election officials and ask them how they're adapting to the COVID epidemic. Listen to them, give them space, and really hear what they are experiencing, and then ask them if they feel like they need more resources. And some of them may be in good shape, and that's great. Some of them might need something that's not resources, and you should find out what that is. If they do feel like they need more resources to respond to the pandemic, to make sure the election is secure, to recruit poll workers, find new polling locations, etc., and we'll get into that, I would encourage you to encourage them to call their U.S. Senator, your U.S. Senator, and ask for their legislative director, and ask that person, the legislative director for your U.S. Senator, your senior senator, to prioritize funding for elections in the next stimulus bill. There is going to be another stimulus, regardless of how you feel about that. If there's going to be another stimulus, it should include funding for elections. The fundamentals of our democracy are at stake, and it is really important that we support our election officials by getting them resources. We'll get into more of the nitty-gritty of that, but that is our goal. So please plan to pick up the phone this week, talk to your local election official unless you've got an election underway. We hope that you'll also meet with some of your election officials in a longer conversation forum at a time that's good for them as a next step. So before we dive in and tell you what we hope you will do, I want to find out what you already have done. So those of you on the Zoom, you have a poll in front of you. Have you talked to your local election officials before? And you should be able to pick multiple. Yes, but only briefly. Yes, I've been a poll worker before. Yes, I've had meetings with my election officials before. No, or other. And folks are weighing in. I'll give you another 20 to 30 seconds, and then I'll let you see what the results are. This is a great way for us to stay in touch with you throughout the webinar and make sure that we're aware of who you are, what your experience is, so that we're speaking to your needs. Okay, another 10 seconds and we'll wrap the poll. Looks like most people have weighed in. Okay, so the results are 50% of you have not talked to your local election official, which is totally normal, and we're so thrilled that you're here. Another 21% have only talked to your election official briefly. 28% of you have been poll workers. You are amazing. We love you. Thank you for doing that. The election officials are applauding if you don't see them. That's wonderful. And then 21% of you have had meetings with your election officials before, so you have some expertise on this already, and that's wonderful, and we hope that you can bring that to share with others and broaden that. And then maybe some of you have had other interactions, a small number. Okay, so we're gonna move on. We'll have other polls to keep you engaged and get a sense of where you all are at given the number of folks we have on the call. So why cultivate relationships with your local election officials? Well, in addition to the short term that we feel this urgent need to get more funding to them and to your states to respond to the COVID pandemic and make sure everyone has safe voting options, they're really important, right? They have incredible sway over how elections run. And you want to get to know them because you want to make sure, I think if you're on this call, you want to make sure that people's votes are counted securely and safely. And part of that is going to be decided by them. And it's going to be decided by what resources they have, what expertise and talent they have available to them to deliver that election to you. And of course, there are bad election officials. There's no, like, nobody's perfect, right? But most of your election officials are trying their very best to deliver free and fair elections. And so figuring out how you can help them is critical. There are a few states where local election officials are not the decision makers. Delaware and Connecticut in particular don't have really what you would call local election officials, but in most states they are where it's at in terms of decision making. So quickly, how COVID-19 is impacting our elections. I think a lot of you have already seen this in your own states, and I'd love for you to share what you've experienced in terms of the impact in the chat right now so that other people can see that, and I'll share a couple of those pieces of feedback in my presentation. But as I said at the outset, no one should have to choose between their health and their vote or put family members at risk because they voted in person. That's not an okay choice. So we want people to have options. We want them to be able to vote safely in person and ideally expand early voting so that there's not one compressed day where a lot of people might need to stand in line. And we want absentee or mail-in voting options so that people who don't feel safe going out or are not safe going out do not have to. That is an accessible option, and that includes being able to register and request an absentee ballot online. Ideally, that cuts down on paperwork. All of these systems do not get set up overnight. They're extremely difficult and expensive to set up brand new, and they take time. And so some states are not going to be able to set these up on time. In some states, there's not the willingness to do that. But in most places, we're wanting voters to have choices. Nobody should be shoehorned into one option that's not a good option for them. So social distancing obviously is a priority. I think all election officials are thinking about how to make that a reality for elections, both for poll workers and for voters. But we also really want to see safe vote counting and auditing. Auditing is an important part of election security, but that needs to be done at social distance now too, which can be challenging. We need more new, younger, more tech savvy election workers in most places to both, in some cases, help with the mail absentee voting process and definitely in person. And we need new voting locations that don't endanger older and vulnerable populations. So all states have some kind of mail-in voting option for military and overseas voters and for folks who need to vote absentee. As many of you know, some states like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Hawaii are permanent mail-in voting states with vote centers for people who need to or want to vote in person. And then California, Montana, and Arizona have very high rates of mail-in voting, and it's fairly easy for them to move towards an option for everyone to mail in. But for most states, the vast majority of voters vote in person. And so adding this mail-in option for everyone who wants or needs it, which is our recommendation to keep people safe from COVID, takes an enormous amount of adaptation, more staff, learning new systems, more printing, more postage, educating the public about how to vote. It's a lot. And our elections are run at the state level and as we said, the local level. But this is a giant logistical and administrative task to run an election before COVID. And now we're asking for this additional burden to be taken up by local election officials. And in some cases, we're not giving them any new resources to do it, which is not going to work. And so I'm going to pull now from the chat somebody, just your experiences during COVID. Someone in Pennsylvania who voted by mail in the last election, somebody who's really happy because they're in Washington and they've always voted by mail, or not always, but they voted by mail for a long time. Someone who's a stroke survivor who did mail in. So some different experiences. In Arizona, they've got permanent early voting. That's great. I'm from Wisconsin, and I never in my life had to call my family and friends and say, how are you voting? Are you safe to vote tomorrow before the primary, which was very early. It was very chaotic and challenging, especially in larger population areas. And I hope we never do that again, but we've been seeing recurrences of just, a combination of poor planning and lack of resources, or, in Washington, D.C., there were lines past midnight for our primary. because honestly, the election officials didn't ask for help. They just fell behind on mail-in ballots and they just didn't say anything. So there's a kind of, had someone been talking to them, maybe we would have gotten into a better place. We'll see. So funding, we need money. Congress has passed some funding for security and for COVID adaptation. It is not enough, but it is something. So they passed $425 million in December for security. And we were really excited. There's so much that needs to be done on security. And then COVID came along and the US Election Assistance Commission had to wisely say, you know what, you can use this money for COVID adaptation. We know that security is important, but there's no way to get you money fast enough for the primaries, so you can use this. And then some of that money has not gotten to the local election officials still, despite that need for the primary, I should flag. And then in April, Congress passed $400 million specifically for COVID adaptation. Groups like the Brennan Center have been saying we need more like $4 billion. So it's not, again, not enough, but some of that money has gotten out to the states, and most election officials that I'm aware of have PPE because of that money at this point. So it has done some good, but it hasn't done a bunch of the things we need to do, which we'll be talking about today. So just one more thought, and then we'll hear from our speakers who are way more exciting and interesting than I am. Who are your local election officials? I think that a lot of people might make assumptions about, because they're so important, their level of kind of power, or, you know, that they might be distant or above you in some way. And I would just say they tend to be very strong administrators and managers. They are managing a huge operation. Imagine, you know, a few times a year you have to plan a gigantic event, and if something goes wrong for one person, you are going to be in big trouble potentially. It just has to be perfect for every single person. So imagine that level of stress. And most election officials don't just administer elections. They also have 10 other jobs. One rural county clerk described her job as this. She's one of 3 staff for her entire county. She does business name filings, marriages, environmental documents, birth and death and land records. She manages 50 different mandated programs and 13 budgets with 3 staff and several elections this year. So they're dealing with a lot, and so there's a lot of expertise in administration there. Some folks have a lot of expertise on voting access and security, and others don't. So when we go to them with what's important to us, you have to remember everything else that they're holding, and just be sympathetic. And to add to that, on average, election officials tend to be female. They tend to be overworked and underpaid. That really is more the case the more rural you go, because of rural county budgets or rural locality budgets. Some larger communities have generous staffing, relatively speaking. But just be aware that even though these individuals have a lot of power over your vote, does not mean that they don't have 10 bosses. Their locality's executive, their locality's council, whoever appoints them, or they have to get elected themselves, and then every candidate on the ballot who is going to freak out if something goes wrong, and every voter, and their state election director, and their secretary of state or lieutenant governor, and their state legislature who writes the rules that they have to play by. So a lot of bosses. So just keep that all in mind when you're calling them. And so now I want to just give it over to our incredible election officials. Tina Barton is the Rochester Hills City Clerk. She's the president of the Oakland County Clerks Association of Michigan, and she's also an appointee by the U.S. Conference of Mayors to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission Board of Advisors that has advisory role in developing the security standards for our voting systems. So incredible to have you on. Thank you so much, Tina, and just give me a second to put your slideshow up and share it.
So while you're doing that, thank you for having me here. I am really excited that over 160 people care to be talking about elections tonight. So that makes this election official's heart super happy that there are so many people that want to get engaged in the process, care about the process, and thank you for providing this for everyone.
You ready to go? Do you see my
Yep.
screen? Okay.
Yep. I'm all set. You can go ahead and go. Just so you know, on I think the beginning and the last slide, I provided my contact information. So my email is on there, and that is my direct line to my office in Rochester Hills, and that will ring directly into me. So you can go ahead. Next slide. So first I want to talk about how COVID is impacting our elections. And that really is an incredibly broad topic, and it seems to be almost changing daily, where we're adding new things to this list. So in Michigan, we're experiencing a record number of absentee voters. So we had a proposal that passed in November of 2018 that allowed for people to apply for an absentee ballot without reason. We also saw this year where our secretary for this particular election cycle and for November, we typically would only send an AV application out to those who are on our permanent absentee application list or those who had requested one. But our secretary chose to send an AV application out to every registered voter in the state of Michigan. So while we already had a proposal passed that was increasing our absentee numbers, the fact that every single registered voter was sent an AV application increased those numbers tremendously. So for example, in November of 2016, I processed about 13,000 absentee ballots in my community. I have a population of about 75,000 with 55,000 registered voters, 32 precincts. So looking at 13,000 absentee ballots in November of 2016, this is August, well, we're actually July right now, right? We have an August primary, and it's only the first week of July. I already have over 16,000, approaching 17,000 absentee ballots. So I have already exceeded my numbers from the November 2016 election. So with the record number of absentee ballots coming in, that's required that I hire more workers. So I've had to bring in 5 temporary part-time workers just to help with the extra load. It requires that I have larger absentee voter counting boards because I'm going to have more absentee ballots to process. It also means I have to spread that absentee counting board out. A lot of my clerk friends across the state have had to move their absentee voter counting boards off-site to another facility because in order to social distance, they didn't have enough room at their city or township facilities. It's also required that we purchase more equipment. So for instance, things like high-speed letter openers so that we can open those ballot envelopes quickly. Tabulators meant that some of the communities that were larger communities needed to apply to purchase high-speed tabulators so that they could process a lot of ballots very quickly. It also meant that we had to establish precinct protocols that we've never had to establish before. So for instance, workers wearing masks, face shields, gloves. We had to purchase hand sanitizer stations. We had to provide them tape and things along those lines, stickers to put 6-foot markers down for social distancing in the precinct. It also means that we're going to be wiping down our privacy booths after each voter. So once a voter votes in that privacy booth, we're going to put that privacy booth as being clean. So we're going to clean that, and we're going to put something down on there that specifically says that this privacy booth has been closed for cleaning. So we're going to clean it, and we're going to allow it to dry before we allow another voter to go in there so that none of the Clorox wipes that we'll be using would get on the ballot and possibly ruin one of our tabulators. We've also purchased one-time use pens. So basically we purchase pens that are wrapped in plastic, and once they take that pen and they use that pen to vote with, that pen is going to go home with them. So I have purchased 10,000 of those for our precincts. We also purchased one-time use styluses. They're kind of like, actually they look a lot like the cotton swabs that you're seeing them do the COVID testing. They're on a long stick that looks like an extra long Q-tip. And so these are cotton swabs on a stick, and we were able to purchase these through our election vendor. And these will be used specifically on the ADA devices that have touch screens. So as the voters touch those screens, they don't have to use their hands to do that. They can use these cotton swabs to do it, and that will help keep the screens clean for the next voter. Go ahead. So also it means that we have an inspector shortage. I beg of you, to contact your local election official and apply to be an election worker. So in Michigan, the average age of an election worker is 74. So that means that most workers are falling into that high risk category. So for a presidential election, I would typically hire a minimum of 300 to 400 people to work in my precincts. That means I would have at least 8 to 10 workers in each precinct. I can tell you for this particular election cycle, because we're starting to see the numbers increase in Michigan. So we saw the numbers go down with COVID. Our deaths are way down, but we're starting to see now the new cases are starting to rise drastically. And with those new cases rising, we're starting to get a lot of people call in and say, you know what, initially I said I would work, but now I'm just not quite comfortable. So just today alone, I had 4 people cancel. So where I would normally have 8 to 10, I currently only have 4 people confirmed for each precinct. That is a hardship. And in the state of Michigan, I'm required to have a minimum of 3 people on staff at all times at a precinct. It also means that I've had to look at precinct relocations. So of the 32 precincts I have, I've had to relocate nearly half of those. Well, actually half of those, 16 of those, we've had to relocate and go into schools. And so these were precincts that were already in senior facilities of any kind, whether it have been a senior living facility or a senior clubhouse at a facility. We've had to pull those precincts out of there and place them in schools. We've also had to pull all of our precincts out of churches. We've had to relocate them because a lot of the churches in Michigan aren't even meeting right now. And so we can't expect them to allow us in there to have a precinct if they're not allowing their congregations through the door. We also looking at money. You know, revenues are down. For instance, it may not seem like a big deal, but for a local community like our Parks and Rec leagues, we typically make a lot of money off of our Parks and Rec leagues when they're renting the fields, doing those kinds of things. Permits, so the building process kind of came to a complete halt in Michigan, so we didn't see funding coming in from building permits. Things where we would normally have as revenue sources were suddenly shut down. It also meant that our revenue sharing is going to be down this next year for our city of the money that would come from the state. So of our $55 million budget in our city, we saw a $7 million hit due to COVID. So our costs are going up and the funding is promised. We're hoping that it's coming. We've submitted for it, but we don't have it in hand yet. And I've worked in government for 30 years and until it's in our bank, I don't count it as actually coming there. So I don't budget based on what the promises are or what they say is going to come my way. I budget on what I actually have. Next slide, please. So how your election official can help protect your vote. Well, Christopher Krebs, who's the head of cybersecurity at the DHS, basically stated not too long after the 2016 election that we recognized right away that the big game for our adversaries was going to be the 2020 election. And something that was so critical for us is that in January of 2017, the DHS actually declared elections as critical infrastructure. So as you look at these possible actors that could be attacking our elections, maybe what their motivations might be, it could be somebody like a nation state actor, so a different country, but it could also be somebody who's on the inside that maybe is a disgruntled employee. You know, the motivations there can go all the way from causing disruption to the election to really just some financial gain or just trying to cause problems, period. So as election officials, it's our job to look at this from every single angle possible of all these possible actors and what their motivations might be and how do we protect your records. Next slide. So one thing that's really important is in the past, there hasn't always been this real love affair between federal government and state government. There was kind of this, do not step on our territory. You know, this is state government, this is federal government, you stay in your lane, we'll stay in our lane. But what we all recognize after 2016 is on our own, we were not strong enough to combat some of these actors. And so we needed to combine resources and we needed to recognize the fact that we're all operating on the same team. So a couple of different groups were created with DHS, and that is the MSI-SAC, which now all 50 states belong to. And there's an elections infrastructure group that was created that's called the EISAC. So if your local election official is not already part of this organization, I would strongly encourage them to join the EISAC, because you will be getting, I frequently get emails from the EISAC telling us what are things that are vulnerabilities that we need to be looking out for, or what are who are potential actors that have already maybe even penetrated somewhere else, and so we need to be on the lookout. And they'll tell us what the types of things that they're seeing and where we might be vulnerable. DHS is also willing to do vulnerability testing for your local election officials, as well as your local unit of government. So when we talk more about how we can protect your vote, what do I think still needs to be done across the country, and what are some of the things that we're looking at? I think it's really important that states replace their voting machines with machines that have a paper trail. I'm really big on that, because I feel like voting machines with a paper trail give you something to audit. And it's extremely important that if we are hacked, if somebody gets in and were to disrupt our system, even if they were to disrupt the data, at the end of the day, even if they mess with my programming, I can open up that ballot box at the end of the day. I can pull out those paper ballots, and I could do a hand count based on the paper ballots that are in front of me. And I need a paper trail in order to know how the machine counted those votes, and did they count them as cast. And so it's really important to have a paper trail. It's also important that voting machines be tested to the EAC voluntary voting system guidelines, and that the electronic poll books are not connected to the internet. Really important point there. Also, robust post-election audits need to be implemented on all state levels. So we have a robust system here in Michigan. We're also in the process of piloting risk limiting audits, which I am a huge fan of those. I was the first community in the state of Michigan to pilot a risk limiting audit. If your state is not doing those, I strongly suggest that you check into that. They're a fantastic way to audit your elections in a robust way. States also need to look at their voter registration databases and make sure that they're up to date. We all know the older our computer is, the more vulnerable it gets, right? And so a lot of these databases are over a decade old. We need to be looking at that. We need to be using this funding to bolster and to build and to strengthen our databases. We also need to be performing mandatory logic and accuracy pre-election testing on all of our voting equipment. So what does that mean? That means, so here in Michigan, for instance, we're very decentralized. So we have about over 1,500 clerks in the state of Michigan. In the state of Michigan, the county clerks actually program the elections, but the local clerks, so I'm a city clerk, actually test and run the elections. So the county programs it. I have that program, I put that into my machine, and so this logic and accuracy test is I have test ballots I'm going to run through based on using the programming that the county has provided, and I'm going to make sure, is the programming reading the ballot as cast? That way we can make sure on election day, we know that that program was working just fine when we tested it 2 weeks prior. So we have to have mandatory logic and accuracy tests to make sure that the programming is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, and it's reading the ballot the way that it should. We have to have party balance in precincts, and we have that in Michigan. So for everything that we do, whether it's signing a document, whether it's checking seals, whether it's sealing a ballot box, a Republican and a Democrat does that together. They also go through the audit process together at the end of the night. So we also have to have party balance in our precincts, and we have to send that list to our parties in the state of Michigan, the Republican and the Democratic Party, so that they can see we are making a concerted effort to make sure we have balance. There also has to be an identifiable chain of custody of the ballots. In other words, where are your ballots? So I heard someone say one time, you know, it's 10 o'clock at night, who has your ballots, right? So you need to know when you receive your ballots and when they go to the precinct, who has that chain of custody. So you need to have people signing off each step of the way that these are the number of ballots that I gave you for that precinct. Yes, I'm signing this. These are the number of ballots that I received. We also need to have receiving boards that are doing audits on these precincts at the end of the night. And it's really important to have two-factor authentication on your logins. So identifying the gap when we talk about the relationship between election officials and advocacy groups, I really honestly think a lot of times it's a lack of knowledge about what the other person does and what the other person's motivations are. And so there are so many different voter advocacy groups. I mean, you can have groups, you can have 100 groups that all start with the word democracy, right? And so it can get confusing and kind of overwhelming for election officials to know exactly which group am I dealing with, and is this someone I've dealt with before, and really what are they trying to accomplish, because we do see so many of them. And we have to recognize that every state processes elections and registrations differently. So we're not all doing things the same way. So we have to recognize that too. So we also have to look at, there's been this sense of us versus them. So for instance, I taught a class very similar to this with some different groups, and as for instance, it was the ACLU. And so I said, obviously as a clerk, when I get a FOIA from the ACLU or when I get an email from the ACLU, it's usually something that I'm like, oh great, what are they trying to figure out that I did wrong? So there's been this relationship with advocacy groups that hasn't always been positive. And so that doesn't always bring us to a point of where we're like all touchy-feely about meeting you, okay? And so some advocates seem to think that we're trying to make voting difficult. We're really not. We're trying to make sure everybody's playing by the same rules and that we're following the law. And so we're not trying to be difficult, but we are rule followers. Clerks are, we are law followers, and that's what we do. And we have to fall within those guidelines. We also have this problem, and I think people in general have this problem, that we think and speak in general terms of we all do this, or this always happens, or that never happens. And so we have to recognize that not everybody is a bad person. Not every group is a bad group. Not everybody's coming with negative thoughts, that we are trying to work together. And so we have to learn to speak more specifically to one another and not in such broad terms. I think it's really important resources that we learn about sharing our contact resources, specifically reaching disabled voters and minority voters. Your groups know people that I don't know. You have inroads to groups that I do not have. So we can work together as this great team in order to help get information out. And so that could be a really valuable partnership. So working toward that common goal, recruiting an election force, as we already mentioned, we're struggling to find workers. We need workers with IT talent. We need to have a unified message about registration and voting. That's one of the frustrations that we have as election officials, is that the message that is going forward sometimes from advocacy groups doesn't always match the message that is coming out of the local clerk's office. And so we'll get a lot of duplicate registrations, and it causes us a lot of excess time. Where if we could combine together and hold registration and voting drives together, that would be super beneficial to us. And I think it would also help the voter too and cause less confusion. Recognizing and fixing problems, there has to be commitment from both sides that we're willing to work together. I can tell you as an election official, I embrace that opportunity. I welcome you anytime in my office to come in and see how can we best work together. Even if we don't always see things eye to eye on a lot of other things, my approach to things is how do we find the common ground, and that common ground that we have, let's be really great at it. And so those election security safeguards, identifying ways to protect our elections together. So again, working in that relationship together. So communication, creating collaborative coalitions, maybe we can work together there, hold scheduled phone conference meetings, even something like what we're doing right now helps to get that word out. Produce action items of process improvements or public education. So we're coming together to have these conversations, and let's find out how we can both do this better by producing actual action items and not just having conversation. But publicly also message our collaborations, and so we can openly promote and share our resources. So I hope to do that. I know this is a lot of information in a little bit of time. I welcome you again to reach out to me. Thank you again for taking part in this, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina. We're so lucky to have you on. And we will have time for questions for Tina after we hear from Dustin, who's going to speak, and then we'll do a group of questions for them together, a couple more polls, and we'll wrap. Dustin, you have the floor.
Great. Oh, thank you very much for having me. Tina's excellent presentation covered a lot of what I wanted to say, but I'll just touch on a few things that I think is very important for people to understand. When you're reaching out to election officials, find out, I mean, many people don't know what kind of election officials they have in their state at all. They don't know whether it is a bipartisan commission, whether it is a partisan commission, whether it's run by your county clerks, whether it's run by a nonpartisan civil servant. Different states have all kinds of different forms of election administration. So make sure that you are, you know who you're talking to. Do some basic research, and your basic research will probably start with a call to your local board of elections or county clerk's office, and start off with those questions, because that's going to give you a basis on who you're talking to, what their goals are, what their motivations are. In New York, we happen to have a bipartisan commission. So that means that there are two people that are in charge of every county elections, one Republican, one Democrat, and their office staff is split equally down the middle. And so there's some recourse that if you're not getting what you need from one commissioner, you can go to the other. But what Tina said, which is so important, is to understand that a lot of times commissioners and advocates have not always gotten along. I've tried to get along with advocates as much as I can, but even I have a give and take with them as well, because often advocates are coming in on behalf of the voters and they see elections commissioners as a natural enemy. It doesn't have to be that way, but you're on two sides of the same coin. The elections commissioners are supposed to protect the vote, but also make people adhere to the rules. And sometimes some of those rules means ballots don't count, which is not something that we want to do, but it is what happens. And then advocates always want more ballots to count and more opportunities for voters. And so there's a natural friction there. But if you understand that most of these elections commissioners are overworked and underpaid and are understaffed, you can understand what they need from you is your help, and not just accusations, not just pointing out problems. Many times we know what the problems are, but how we can go about and work as partners together. One of the things Tina said about duplication of registration forms, that is a big problem, especially in presidential years. And I'm really worried about it this year, because during COVID, registrations are down huge in our state, in New York, but all across the country, because this last 3-4 month period, registration drives aren't happening. DMVs aren't open. All these things haven't happened. So a flood of registration forms are going to come in. And what voters may do is say, well, sure, I filled it out at the supermarket, at that registration table, but I'm going to go do it online at DMV, and I'm going to do it over somewhere else. I'm going to do it here, there, everywhere. And what happens when you do that is we have to process every form. We can't just choose a form that we get. So one form turns into 5 forms for the same person, and obviously that's more work for the office. In many states, in New York, there's a live link to the registration database that is the New York State Board of Elections Registration Database. So it's a live link to what the registration is. You can do, at your registration tables, have a computer and look somebody up and see if they're at the right address, see if they're the right party for a primary. These are the kind of things that could help when you're doing registration drives. I would love to do registration drives with you. Not always can do that, but I do a lot of them when I could leave the house. Now, and of course, the ultimate ask, the thing that every elections commission is going to ask for is inspectors we are at a very crucial time, because not only are we losing some of the inspectors that we have, it's very hard to train new inspectors under these COVID guidelines. You can only have so many people in a room, and people are even afraid to congregate. In New York, we're up to 50 now that can be in a room, which is more than I need for training. That doesn't mean 50 people want to be in a room or want to come down and train. So, and boards don't necessarily have the time or resources to set up virtual training, especially smaller boards. So, and virtual training is just not good training. I mean, you can't teach a person how to use an electronic poll book through a virtual training if they've never used one before. You know, so there has to be some kind of hands-on training, especially if it's a new piece of technology, a new piece of equipment, or a new way of doing things in our COVID settings. And finally, and I'll get, so we can get to the questions, funding is a huge issue. The CARES grant that we got, the $400 million that went to the different states, I can tell you in New York, and I'm sure it's the same across the country, we've already started to blow through that, and probably through our primary elections, and probably will not have enough to do what we need in the general election, which would be 3 or 4 times what we got in the primary election. That $400 million is a drop in the bucket. In New York, for example, we had to send out applications to every voter. We've never done that before, so that means we had to set up vendors to do that. We had to, pay for postage for every absentee, and we also got slammed with absentee voters. Not only was turnout high, which is great, but absentee voter turnout was 8 to 10 times more than what we normally would get. I got 24,000 absentees in the June election. We normally would get 3,000. So that's stuff that we didn't have time to plan for. And if we're looking at a general election, which instead of 40,000 voters are going to show up in my county, 240,000 voters are going to show up, and all of those vote by absentee. You can imagine the kind of nightmare scenario that is for cost, but also for duplicating results and getting those out in a timely fashion. We're just starting to get the absentee results out now, and the election was on June 23rd. So, and that's all across New York State. In fact, I think New York City just started opening their absentees on Monday or something, or today or something like that. So, having some patience for when we're going to get results out is important as well. So those are my highlights, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Okay, so we have a ton of questions for the pair of you, and you can also pull questions from the chat if you see something that you really want to answer. Just 2 top questions. We will share the recording of this video, of this webinar. You can find your local election official information at FVAP. I shared that link in the chat as well. You can share that with all the attendees who registered. So a bunch of questions. Feel free to just nab whichever, start responding, whichever one makes sense. But what is the proper way to ask if, well, maybe, sorry, I'm going to skip that one because it's a little bit confusing. At what point is it too late to expect state and local election officials to set up and implement new voting systems? We should push for as much voting by mail as possible, says Terry, but at some point, don't we need to work with systems we've got and make them work as much as possible?
I think, okay. Well, I was just going to say that you have to, first, you have to recognize what your law says. So you have to look at that. What does the law constrict you to, and what are the parameters there? And so that's the very first thing that we have to go to, is to see, does this fall within the law? What are the parameters? So for instance, for me, to move my precincts, state law would require here in Michigan that if I'm going to do a temporary removal of a precinct and a relocation, I have to do it at least 60 days prior to the election. So in implementing new polling locations, things like that, you also have to be able to properly test the system, my opinion, before you need to go live with it, because you're just asking for disasters if you do that. So if you don't have proper timing to not only create and properly test a system, it should not be implemented in a presidential cycle. At least in a presidential cycle, even if you're using a system that is not brand new, you already know the good and the bad and the ugly, all of that, right? So you know what to expect, you know what to troubleshoot, all of those things. But a brand new system, that is not the time to be testing it in a presidential cycle, because you don't know what's going to happen and you don't really know how to troubleshoot it just yet.
Yeah, and also remember that an electoral system is not one system that is isolated. Everything feeds another thing. So one of the questions in the comments was, well, implementing vote by mail. Well, that means different things to different people. If you're talking about like expanded absentees where more people can request absentees, so that's one thing. But if you're talking about actually mailing live ballots out to every voter that is registered, well, your registration system needs to be great. And if your registration system isn't great, you can't mail live ballots. In New York, we have 1.2 million voters throughout the state that are in inactive status because we have mailed them a check card that has come back saying that they don't live where they live, because we don't have automatic voter registration, because we don't have online voter registration. And it's gotten better with the DMV, but it's still not perfect. And so how do I mail them a ballot if I already know that they don't live there? And so they need an in-person voting option. And to try, and look at what happened with the post office just this last primary. I'm sure Tina experiences it too when there's a large mail elections. Sometimes they don't put the postmark code on the envelopes. Well, our receive by dates are based on postmark code. So if we get ballots after election day and there is no postmark code on it, many times we have to throw out that ballot, and that's not the problem of the voter. The voter put it in the ballot in the mailing office at the right time. It's the problem of the mail service. It's not the problem of the BOE, but it still throws out the vote. So it's July. It's too late to implement massive radical change for November. It's just not going to happen. There's no money to do it. There's no plans to do it. But what you can do is amplify what you have. So you could have an expanded absentee where anybody who wants to be able to request it can get it. You can have expanded early voting hours or early voting polling locations to spread out early voting lines so you don't have as many people in line. You can do that. Those are the kind of things that you can do now and then work on these other systems for another election.
Okay, Tina, other than being poll workers, what kind of assistance would you welcome from people like those on this call? And do you have suggestions about how we can best approach less friendly election officials in some places?
Well, so other than poll workers, which I'm going to again just say one more time how desperately we need you, I would say if you can't do, if you don't want to be a poll worker, or you can't for some reason, that you can be a communication piece for us. You can help spread that message. And so you can tell your 5 or 10 friends who can then tell their 5 or 10 friends. And so for a lot of that is us just getting the message out of what we need. Other than that, also we need, I would say people who are joining other groups to be messaging the same way that we're messaging. And I mentioned that earlier. And as Dustin mentioned too, the challenge is the duplication in the registrations, those kinds of things. So it would be having those conversations with us about what you're doing in our community or in our county so that we can maybe take part in it, or we can at least be prepared for it, running those questions by us so we can say, hey, this is a great idea, maybe that's not so great an idea, or how do we partner on that. And then as far as approaching, those that aren't so friendly, I get it. Not everybody is like, my doors are open, come see me. I want to hear what you have to say. I understand that. I think it's approaching them in a thoughtful and respectful way. I think that even if you're adversaries, if you can start from a point of respect for the other person and what they do, that point of respect will allow conversation to take place.
If I could jump on that too, one thing that is of general need, especially in larger urban areas, is translators. Elections do not necessarily have the staff or the ability to provide language services for especially anything other than Spanish in many areas. Census requirements make us have to have ballots that are in Spanish in certain areas, but not necessarily if you get outside of like places like Los Angeles and New York City, moderate sized cities aren't going to provide, a Bangladesh, language service or, for a cluster of immigrants. So if you know your city and you know where there are high areas of a certain sect or a certain, different language speaking area, and you know what the polling places they are, see if they can provide poll watchers that are fluent in these languages and can help out as volunteers, because there's no way boards of elections can always help out every language that is needed on an election day.
One of the things that I'm hearing also from some of the larger communities is that not all of public transit is up and running on its normal schedules or the way that it normally would. And so maybe reaching out to groups that, say for instance, we have an older persons commission in our city that also has 2 other communities that use it. So it's basically like a senior, almost like clubhouse type thing and massive facility. They have their own transportation where they go pick people up, they take them to doctor's appointments, that sort of thing. They would also take them to vote if need be, but they're closed right now. And so these are individuals who might have used that as their access to transportation that now might not have access to transportation. So how do you help facilitate that? How do you maybe sponsor Ubers with your company or things like that, or working out ways to provide transportation to some of these individuals. I would reach out to organizations that specifically service maybe blind voters, just looking at those types of organizations of how do we help you in transportation issues as we're looking at a lot of mass transit being shut down or not running the normal cycles that they typically would run.
Great, and that sort of answers one of the questions. Someone had asked about rides to the polls, and I think generally that's outside of the scope of what you can provide, especially given these new burdens, but I wondered if you had anything to say to that. And I'll just double up on questions. Lots of folks would like your PowerPoint as a PDF. Is that an option?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Lots of questions about the Postal Service and if there's a problem with the Postal Service close to the election. I'm not sure if you want to try to take that one.
Well, I think that we have to look at the fact that Dustin and I have already talked to you about, we're already seeing our workload, 8 to 10 times, right? And if we're seeing our workload with absentee ballots climb by 8 to 10 times, guess what? That means the Postal Service is seeing their workload increase by 8 to 10 times by every single community or every single county. And we do have to recognize that this is not just a burden, or I don't even like to use that word, but this is not just an increase in responsibility or really something that we've never experienced before, to be honest with you. But our Postal Service is going to experience an influx of election mail like they have never had before. I promise you that. And so, yeah, I do have concerns of, were they prepared for that? Were they looking at that? Or has COVID brought that on them so quickly? I mean, we've talked with them. We have conversations with them frequently. I make phone calls to my postmaster. But still, yeah, I am concerned about that. And honestly, I'm telling our residents in our community, we have we have a drop box, or if you want to come into City Hall, I would drop your ballot there. And if you want to put it in the mail, I would track your ballot.
Another thing is to remember that boards of elections don't make election law. And one of the things that needs to change, in my opinion, in New York, but also throughout the country, is we need to get away from postmark dates and get to receive by dates that are after the election day. The old fear that somebody's going to put in a ballot after election day and it's going to swing the election is just ridiculous to me, especially when we're talking about these numbers of absentees. And who cares? Somebody wanted to vote, they vote. We have to stop thinking of election day as a day and more of a week. And I know there's a bill in the New York State Senate about making it this, we have up to 7 days after election to receive a ballot if it's postmarked by election day. is just removing that if it's postmarked. Just say we have 7 days to receive it, no matter when it got mailed, because of these postmarks are not getting on because the delays at the post office. And it's not just delays because of ballot mails, but the way we're campaigning now is totally different. Door-to-door campaigning is not going to be a thing. You know, and if it is, it's not going to be the same. So you're going to see a lot more mailing campaigns, which increases the burden on the mail system. I think they're going to make a lot of money. I think they're going to be fine for this cycle. So I'm not as worried about the budget issues that I was worried about earlier in the year. I'm worried about that for next year. But what I'm worried about is I'm worried about capacity on their end.
Okay, so we have a lot more questions for you. I want to respect everyone's time. I also want to get to a couple polls and asks that we have for folks. If it seems like you guys want to stay on a little longer and answer questions, we'll get to that. But let's make sure that everybody knows what we need from them going forward. And just make sure that you're paying attention. We're going to do another poll. Why cultivate a relationship with your election officials? I read this out loud for folks who might not be right in front of their screen. Local election officials are the primary decision makers when it comes to voting access and security in most states. They may need your local political support. By raising their voices, they can help win congressional funding and make the 2020 election safer and more secure. Working together, you can help ensure voters are better informed about their options and bring transparency to the voting process during COVID. They might just share your interest in moss cultivation or speed snorkeling. So folks are voting now. We've got 2 moss cultivators. All right, give it another 20 seconds. Okay, I'm gonna end polling and share results. So everybody, 83% of you are excited to work to inform voters about their options and bring transparency to the voting process during COVID. But it looks like big chunks of you are bought in for other reasons as well. And at least 9 of you like moss cultivation or speed snorkeling. We now know. Thank you for that. And then now is the part where we ask you to take action. And many of you have already been involved. That's wonderful. We're so glad. But what next steps will you take? We're going to model a call to an election official for you, and somebody who's done a couple of these, Caitlin, on our team is going to speak about that briefly. And then there's some other things that we want you to do. So let's just focus on the call for the moment. We want you to call your local election official this week, unless there's a primary or early voting happening, or some other local election. And we want you to ask them how they're doing and listen to them, and also ask them if they need funding. And if they do need funding, Congress is deciding in the next couple weeks how much, if any, money for elections is going to be in the next stimulus. And they need to hear from their local election officials. Doesn't matter what party they're in, doesn't matter whether they say they support this or not. This is going to be head-to-head negotiated between the leaders of the 2 parties, and those leaders need to be hearing from every single member of their caucus. This needs to be a priority. It has to be in this bill because there's a million things in that bill and they all cost money, and we need to make sure elections is in there, and it's a decent amount of money, as close to that $3.6 billion that the House passed, in our view, as possible.
Can I just give you a quick example? So here in the state of Michigan, when it came to the funding resources that we were going to be allowed to receive, it was based on how many precincts that we had. And so the parameter range put me in where it was, say, 30 to 99. And because I fell in that particular parameter range, my total dollars that I had to spend, if you want to call it that, was $4,500. So that included my PPE for precincts, that included any of the directional arrows or 6 feet apart, or letter openers or scanners or tabulators, anything that I needed. I only had $4,500 to spend.
Wow.
So just think about that. That is That is very little bit of money. I had a clerk from across the state call me who could not afford to purchase sneeze guards, and she purchased clear shower curtains and PVC pipe and made her own because she didn't have funding from her local government source, and she wasn't going to get enough through what she was allowed through the funding that came through the state. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. When we say we need more money, we're not just out there begging for money to have money. We are looking at the very basics of what we are needing in order to make the precincts safe.
And just to jump on that, we need money. I mean, you don't even have to ask us. I'll answer for every election official in America.
We have a Republican and a Democrat together here telling you we need money.
But I will tell you, like, to purchase a high-speed central count absentee scanner is $45,000, and so, you know, and everybody needs that now if we're having all of these absentees. And this is not, and many times there are limited vendors we can go to. We can't go buy this stuff at Staples. We can't, and you don't want us to. You want tested machinery, and this is expensive stuff. And our county governments in New York fund elections, and that's usually how it goes, is that the county seats are funding the elections out of their local budgets. And while there are some guidelines for them, I can tell you, I've already been told by my county executive, yeah, you're not spending this, you're not spending that. And then, you know, even though I have authority to go over that, I better have a good reason. And they're having austerity, and they're having layoffs, and they're definitely not going to let you hire more people. So a lot of times we're using this grant money to offset costs that we are incurring that we normally would incur too, and trying to pay overtime for our staff and that kind of things, because we need to get this done. So we need money. We need it tomorrow. The 400 million we got is gone, and it's gonna be gone shortly. And if there's not something in the next stimulus package, you're gonna see tremendous burdens on local counties who are already facing tremendous burdens because of lower sales taxes and property taxes and a million other things that are hurting their budgets.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was really compelling and powerful. Since we are at time, I want to do a quick poll and see where people are at and what they can commit to do. And then we will do that sample call for folks who want it and take a few more questions if folks have time, but we'll check in about that when we cross that bridge. Just a poll to see what you are willing to do after this call. That baseline ask, I will call my local election official this week, unless of course there's an election happening, listen to them, and if appropriate, ask them to call our US senators and press the need for funding, and they can tell them exactly what they need it for because they're your local election official. You'll become a poll worker if that's a safe option for you. We don't want you to do that if that's not a safe option. But you must know a younger human that you can ask. They don't have to be in your local area. Anywhere is probably looking for more poll workers right now. So somebody younger that you can ask. You know, a lot of young people are not finding the usual jobs that they would. So while this may not pay, it depends on the state. Sometimes it pays pretty well for one day's work. Others, maybe not so much. It is a way for them to earn some money. I will meet with and build a relationship with my local election officials to help move forward election security. So that really awesome list of things that you can do that Tina gave. There's also the secureourvote.us website with a guide of how to have conversations about security. I will meet with and build a relationship with my local election officials, sorry about that typo, to help do better voter outreach and education, and then other. Thank you so much for filling out the poll. This will just share. So 67% of you are going to call. Thank you so much. And we're going to model that call for you now. So what should we do here? Caitlin, do you want to unmute yourself? Caitlin's been talking to some election officials, so she's going to tell you a couple things about her experience, and then we're going to do a sample call. And Tina and Dustin, I'll let you think about whether you want me to call you or Caitlin can also call me, and I'll be a less friendly election official than the two of you in case folks are a little bit worried. Okay, yeah, sure, Dustin and Tina are amazing, but my local election official, maybe they won't be as nice. Some of the things you might expect if someone's a little bit more unsure at first when you call them. So Caitlin, pointers.
Sure. So I would definitely say, like you've already heard, the first thing that I would say is just ask, like, how is your county, or if they're a local election official by town, like, how is your specific area adjusting? What has happened to you specifically? So keep it more general, just to listen to what changes they've had to make during the pandemic. And once you hear a bit about that, then go ahead and ask if they would need more funding, need more resources, or be willing, after you hear what resources, funding they need, then ask if they'd be willing to voice their support to their senator. And rather than just talking about the CARES Act, specifically say the $3.6 billion within the CARES Act for funding, because it's important that they hear that number, since that's the ask that's being made for election security. Because if you say CARES Act in general, that can mean a lot of different things. So once you learn a bit about them, hear a bit about them, and hopefully they'll loosen up, be able to trust you a bit, then you can ask. And if they're a bit hesitant, if you know what's going on in your state, if your Secretary of State supports it, or if your senators, what they've said in the past, feel free to let them know how it's going on the state level so they feel a bit more comfortable.
Great. Okay. So I think I'm going to have you call me, but I want
Okay,
Tina and
great.
Dustin to just chime in and add what you might say, since I am just pretending I'm not an election official. You can rate my performance. And just the reminder, so if you get someone who's hesitant right away, do not get worried. Remember that they have like 20 different bosses, right? They work for so many different people who have a lot to say about how they should be doing their job. And so they're going to be hesitant sometimes to say, I really need funding, if that is going to be perceived as a criticism of their local council that funds them, their local executive, the state that hasn't given them the money that Congress allocated or hasn't given them enough. So they're going to be hesitant because they live in a political world and they don't know you. So you just want to be affirming and grateful for what they're doing, and listen first, and still make your ask at the end. So Caitlin, I'm ready.
Sure. Okay. So ring, 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 ring.
Jones County, how may I help you?
Hi, this is Caitlin. I was looking to speak with the county clerk.
Speaking.
Hi, so I'm calling just to learn a bit more about election security and elections during the pandemic. If you have a few minutes to talk, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can speak to you for a few minutes.
Okay, if I'm taking up too much of your time, feel free to cut me off. So first, I was just wondering, as a voter in this county, what has happened to you and your resources during the pandemic to be able to run elections?
Well, we've definitely seen a major uptick in absentee ballot requests,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we made it through the primary okay and got those out. I was up pretty late filling some of those requests, but glad we got through that. It did cost more in terms of printing and postage than we had budgeted,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel good about that. I am a little bit worried about the general.
Mm-hmm.
I had kind of a thin crew of poll workers, and I'm a little bit worried with the higher turnout that I'm going to need more. And I've been advertising, but I still don't have the numbers that I need. And
Mm-hmm.
so far, everybody's saying that they're going to come back, but I'm just not sure. And I do have all the PPE I need, and I feel like we should be set in terms of like that part of COVID adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
Can
Well,
I
thank
say,
you
I
for all of.
probably would have, with her initial questions, especially since she used the term election security, I'm probably, going to be a little bit more like, why is she asking that question? So I would probably, ask Caitlin, hi, Caitlin, are you a resident here in Rochester Hills? Are you representing a particular organization? Are you a member of the media? I think that helps us establish what the conversation might be. and maybe what the expectations might be from that person. It helps me know, is that individual someone who's just coming in at ground zero, they don't really know anything about elections, or if she tells me she's representing, a particular advocacy group, then I know that I'm dealing with someone who probably has some elections background and would understand maybe terminology or thought processes more than just the average citizen. So I always try to establish what level is my audience starting at, and then also what might their expectations be of me. What are they trying to get from the conversation? And it's really not that I do feel I have the right to be a little suspicious in the world we live in today. So I do want to ask those questions, and but again, be respectful in the way I do it.
And I should say, and I'll share with everyone who signed up, but we have a script for you of this conversation. And it says, I am a resident of blah, blah, blah. And, thank you. So sorry if we're a little I think we were probably a little more informal than most election officials would be. But maybe we should get to the ask, and then we can do more feedback.
I think, I try not to be as general, in my opinion. If there's a specific security issue that you want to know about, ask about that process, or ask about, a specific type of voting and how we secure. Because if you just say stuff like, well, how do you secure your vote? Well, I have about 1,000 ways I secure your vote. And it's going to be, I would ask for something a little bit more like, okay, well, how do I know my absentee ballot is received? Or how do I know that my vote?
I'm going to pause. I'm so sorry, just because we're at time. I want to get through the whole script first, because this is really focused on the funding ask. So I think we got derailed on the security. I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
I think security has gotten lumped in with resilience around adapting to COVID in a way that I think can be really confusing for everyone. I think that this ask is going to be really about funding for COVID adaptation. So you will see, I'll screen the script to make sure, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't use the word security, but I'll check. We do want people to talk about security, but this first call, as Tina pointed out, maybe is not like the first thing that you say. So sorry, Dustin. Caitlin, do you want to finish?
Sure. So, well, thank you for all of your hard work with elections. And I was just wondering, since you had mentioned PP, stuff like that, did you have access to all of the resources that you needed for that? Or would more funding, more resources be helpful in order to make sure you can do the same thing for the general election?
Well, I think we have enough PPE. It was a scramble, but now I think we are going to be okay. I do think, we could always use more resources. We're not the biggest county, and, resources are good for sure, but I also don't want to complain. I think we can make do with what we have if we have to. But I think it would be good if we could get a little bit more funding. I just don't know where that would come from at this point.
Yeah, of course. Well, since you mentioned it, Congress is going to be debating at the end of July, especially in the Senate, they're going to be debating a new coronavirus stimulus package. And right now there's a $3.6 billion ask up for debate. So if you feel that your county or the surrounding counties could use this extra resources and extra support, would you be interested in calling your senator to voice your support for that funding and kind of let them know that you do need this funding?
Have you talked to the Secretary of State already about this? I know that, they kind of deal with the federal government often.
So the Secretary of State has voiced their support for more funding, but what we're hearing from most senators is that they'd rather hear from local election officials and hear what's happening at the county level, because they're not sure if local election officials actually need it. So there's only so much the Secretary of State could do. If you're comfortable with calling, that would be great.
Okay, yeah. Can you send me more information, and maybe I'll make a call if I can fit it in?
Yeah, of course. I'll email it over to you. And if there's any other questions that you have about the contact information or anything, feel free to respond. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for all of your hard work.
You're welcome. You have a good day.
You too.
So just two little pieces. I think you can tell your local election official to call the legislative director for their state senator so that they know they're calling a staff member, not like this big, like, oh my gosh, I have to prepare to meet the senator. But they are supporting secretaries of state who are asking for money all over the country. And not every secretary is vocally saying they need money, but the National Association of Secretaries of State, the incoming and the current chair, sent a letter saying we need more money, which is pretty official. So you can say secretaries are asking, so if you don't know the situation in your own state. That way there can be reassured that they're not like undermining someone at the state level. So that just explains more what that line is about. And then just making sure you do the hard ask of like, please call the staff of the senator and let them know you need funding and what for. You know, they might want to know from you directly, and you really have an important voice in this moment. So being empowering helps.
I have also been asking when I've reached out to my representatives for them to make sure that this ask this time does not include a match from the states. And so that was a problem this last time, is that it required a match from the state, which is standard language in this type of funding. However, we've never been in a pandemic before. And so to be in this particular situation, the match was a burden, you know, for some of the states. And then also that the funding doesn't come with process changes tied to it, because that's going to hurt some states, because some secretaries will choose to not take the funding if they feel that there are process changes tied to the funding. In other words, like, in order to get the funding, you have to do vote by mail in your state. That's what I'm talking about. So no strings attached and no match is really important to make sure that that money gets to the states and gets filtered down from the state to the local level.
And also flexibility in spending that money too, that it's not just capital, or it's not just buying machinery, that we can use it for overtime costs, that we can use it for extra personnel that we might have to hire for this election, you know, that we might need to use it for cleaning services. This is stuff that isn't in normal election language, grant, budget, but we need it, and because there's nothing normal about this election anymore. So we need this flexibility, and different counties will need different things. So we really need the flexibility to be able to spend on a county level what we need to get to serve our citizens.
And that we could get into a much longer conversation about what the House passed, and there's some things in the House bill that probably do create a very good baseline for what you shouldn't spend taxpayer money on, probably. But it's called the HEROES Act, what the House passed, and there are a bunch of federal mandates in there that are not likely to pass muster in the Senate. Many of them are things that we support as a voting rights organization, speaking just for Public Citizen right now, not for everybody on this call in any way. So just background on what that is, that the state match is really, really important to get rid of. And also, if you're talking to your local election official and they're in one of those states where the state is not passing the money down to the locals, they can say that to their senator too. Like, if there's any requirement in this funding, require that some of it goes to the local government so that we can get the funding where we need it. And that is, you know, whatever their concerns are, they should convey those to the senator. What's important is that they call them. So we have a ton of questions. I want to respect folks' time. We are having some people who need to go, understandably. Can we do 9 more minutes of answering questions and then wrap? Is that okay? Thank you so much. This happens often. We have a lot of enthusiastic folks. We got a question from Norman. Is the $3.6 billion funding just for elections or election security? And I have a thought on that, but I wanted, Tina or Dustin, do you want to answer first?
I think the hope is that Dustin just said is that there really isn't specific designation. That way each state, each each local, whether it be the county level or the local level like I am at a city level, has the ability to use that funding in a way that best meets their needs at that time. And as I mentioned in conversation with you, security means different things to different people, right? So that could be, do they need to bolster their cyber security? Yes, maybe they need to do that. For instance, I just had cameras installed in my back room of the clerk's office because where I have my ballots stored in a locked vault, but I didn't have cameras back there, and we just didn't have that. And so we spent extra money to have cameras installed where the vaults are, so I can see who's going in and out of the rooms, where the ballots are. So I think there needs to be flexibility of what that particular unit needs in order to make sure that they're running a safe, fair, and secure election for their community.
And I think just to add, it can be for elections, like Colorado already has, you can vote by mail, you can vote at vote centers, they do risk limiting audits statewide. They probably don't need this money except to get more poll workers. Everybody needs more poll workers, including Colorado. But Washington State, Oregon, Hawaii, they don't have full risk limiting audits running statewide yet. And so that money could be used for security in the states that already have most of the COVID adaptations in place and need to just do some social distancing work with some of the money. The rest of the money can be used for security, but you have to be there helping and advocating for that in many cases because clerks are busy and overwhelmed often. And then, you know, there's other places where there's just desperate need to make sure the election can run at all, and you're not going to get a security focus in those places. So, you know, you have rock stars like Tina, who's already doing the risk limiting audit, already doing all these things. And then you've got folks where you're gonna have to meet them where they're at with the resources they have and pick some things that are doable and do them with them in any way that you can be helpful.
One of the people in the chat, I think Valerie, said something about in LA they need money to rent hotel ballrooms for vote centers. That is going to be an issue for a lot of counties, that their normal polling places that a lot of times give it for free are not going to be able to do it. And so they may have to rent out ballrooms. So that's money that like a Colorado or Washington that already have a lot of money that they spend on vote by mail, but they do still have in-person voting, and they may still need that money to do that. And we are also looking at an unprecedented turnout in this election, despite this pandemic. And that brings cost. It would have brought cost before this. So we need the flexibility.
Great. So there's been a couple of questions about private help. Can the tech companies donate a bunch of styluses? Can millionaires just give you money to run the election?
I mean,
it's a real question that's coming up a lot.
Yeah, I mean that sounds great, except for we need to know where these poll books are coming from. We need to know where that it's running the right software. You know, a lot of times my electronic poll books are Apple iPads. Sure, I could get a whole bunch of iPads, but they still have to have the the vendor protected software that's on there. You know, so you can't just get equipment from somewhere. It's because we want to make sure they're secure. We want to make sure they don't connect to the internet when they're not supposed to, or that they don't run a third-party app that sends off all kinds of information to the Russians or Chinese or whatever. So you can't get this from anywhere. You have to get it from vendors.
Well, I think it's, one of the things that we've seen helpful from private corporations are more those things that have been specific to really COVID issues. So like face shields. We had like 1,000 of those donated. And so that is a cost saver for me. So when the state only gave me the $4,500 to spend, I didn't have to spend any of my monies of that $4,500 on face shields or PPE or things like that, because some of that stuff was already donated to the local community. And so, yes, they can offset those types of expenses, even if those 10,000 pens that I had to order, if they wanted to donate those one-time use pens so that that voter votes with that pen and they walk out the door with that. And so I think that there are those ways that we can look at private companies. Also with the ride sharing program, we're looking our Secretary of State in Michigan is working with the Detroit Pistons to use their arena as a vote center. And so can private companies then donate towards mass transit, towards Uber rides, towards things like that to help get voters to the vote centers? So there are ways that corporations can get involved and things that they can do to donate that doesn't, to me, cross any lines that I'm very cautious of how much we want them involved in the process. But those types of things like the pens and the PPE, there's nothing that's personal advertisement on there for them. And so those can be donations.
Another thing they can do is an excused day off for their workers to become poll workers for us on election day. Pay them, give them a sick day, whatever, but let them have an excused day off if they become poll workers for boards of elections.
Yes,
Great.
I just reached out to my chamber, and they are running that as an ad that I put together for them to shoot that out to everybody that belongs to our chamber in our area, asking them to allow their employees to have the day off.
I'm going to steal that. That's a great idea. I'm going to steal that.
Last paired question, can you comment on online voting options or ballot harvesting, or both?
So I get asked about online voting all the time because they say, well, if I can bank online, why can't I vote online? And I remind them, when you bank online, every single transaction is tied back to a person, and we know who did what and when they did it. One of the big tenets of our democracy is anonymity. We don't want to know how you voted. We want to know if you voted, but we don't want to know how you voted. And there isn't, at least I haven't seen, a system that is auditable, it's not, and also anonymous at the same time when it comes to online voting. So I don't like that. But I do like paper ballots. I do like expanded mail-in. I do like early voting. I do like a lot of other things. But online voting, it crosses into a realm that I think is really risky, and I'm not so sure that the other options, if they're used in an expanded way, won't help them.
I'm going to agree with that 100%.
Yeah, it is extremely insecure and dangerous, and it's not a technology that we know how to do well right now, and the costs are so high for our democracy if we can't be sure that the election results are right because you picked something insecure to run the election. It's too important. So well said. Thank you so much. We're at time, so thank you again. We're so lucky to have you both in your roles. Thank you for your time. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you everyone who attended. Please call your election officials this week. Talk to them, listen, leave them space to talk, learn from them, and then ask them if they can call to ask for funding. And if you want to do more, we can work with you. You can email info@SecureOurVote. We'll follow up with you after this call with the resources, the script, the slides, the recording, so that you can take action, and hopefully you can find some poll workers as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.